Ethan Walker had always taken pride in building Grill Haven Diner from the ground up. What started as a small roadside hot dog stand had grown into a beloved local chain known for its welcoming atmosphere and comfort food. But lately, he'd received a few anonymous notes and one troubling email about things not being quite right at one of his flagship locations. Rather than confronting his team directly or sending a corporate supervisor, Ethan made a bold decision he would go undercover, not as a CEO, but as a regular customer. It wasn't the first time he'd taken such a step, but this time felt different. He wanted to witness the daily reality his employees lived through, not just the version presented to him in reports and meetings. In preparation, Ethan swapped out his tailored shirts and dress shoes for a hoodie jeans and an old baseball cap. He even went so far as to wear reading glasses he didn't need and grew out some facial stubble to alter his appearance. Every detail mattered. He rehearsed his cover story, a middle-aged man new in town just looking for a bite to eat. No one would suspect he was the man whose framed photo hung in the back office. For Ethan, the disguise wasn't about deception, it was about proximity. He knew that the only way to truly understand what his employees experienced was to stand beside them unnoticed. The plan was simple. He'd walk in during a busy lunchtime window order food like any other customer and quietly take note of what he saw and heard. Ethan hoped he wouldn't uncover anything serious, maybe just some minor training issues or customer service habits that needed tightening. But there was also a nagging feeling in his gut, one he couldn't shake. Something told him this visit would reveal more than he expected. He was determined to remain calm and objective no matter what he discovered. Stepping through the glass doors of Grill Haven Diner, Ethan immediately felt the energy of the place. The bell above the door gave its signature chime, and the smell of grilled onions and sizzling sausages filled the air. The interior hadn't changed much, still the familiar red vinyl booths, chrome accents, and a jukebox tucked in the corner. But there was an undercurrent he couldn't quite put his finger on. Some employees smiled at customers, but there was a tension in the air, like people were putting on a show. Ethan found a seat at the counter and quietly observed already. Noticing signs of friction behind the smiles, he ordered a classic hot dog combo, watching closely as the cashier interacted with others in line. Her tone was polite but robotic. There was no warmth, no spark. Behind her, two other employees exchanged glances and whispered while glancing at a younger worker in the back who seemed to be scrubbing dishes alone. Ethan didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the vibe was off. He jotted down a few mental notes and reminded himself to keep his eyes and ears open. It was just the beginning. For Ethan Walker, this wasn't just a business tactic. It was personal. Grill Haven wasn't just a diner. It was a symbol of his values, his grit and his family legacy. He believed in second chances, in dignity at work, and in leadership that listens. If his business had strayed from those roots, he wanted to know, and he was ready to do whatever it took to bring it back. What he didn't know yet was how much this single visit would change everything, not just for his employees, but for him as well. As Ethan stepped into Grill Haven Diner, the familiar chime of the entrance bell rang out a sound he had heard 1,000 times, but never from this perspective. The nostalgic scent of grilled onions, toasted buns, and fresh coffee filled the air, grounding him in the space he once designed with care. Though the layout remained the same, sleek red booths, polished chrome fixtures, and a counter lined with bar stools, Ethan noticed small details he might have otherwise overlooked. A few napkins had fallen near the condiment station and hadn't been picked up. The tile floor near the soda fountain was sticky. Still, it was far from a disaster, more like signs of a team working hard under pressure. He took a slow walk around the seating area, appearing to look for a place to sit, but really scanning for things most customers would miss. Settling into a corner booth, Ethan took in the rhythm of the room. It was lunchtime, so the diner was comfortably busy. Groups of co-workers on break, a few families with kids, and a couple of older regulars sipping black coffee. The ambient noise was just as he remembered: soft clinks of cutlery, a buzz of casual conversation, and the occasional call from the kitchen. From this vantage point, he watched the staff carefully. The cashier, a young woman named Megan, based on her name tag, handled the register with competence. She greeted customers with the standard script, but her tone lacked any real warmth. Behind her, two other employees worked the line and bussed tables, moving quickly, but without much communication between them. Ethan's eyes followed every small interaction. When a customer spilled a drink, one of the staff members rolled her eyes before cleaning it up. When a senior gentleman asked for a glass of water, the same employee responded with a curt, "Sure," and didn't make eye contact. While no one was overtly rude, there was an absence of genuine hospitality, something Ethan had worked hard to make a core value when he first launched Grill Haven. In fact, it wasn't just about how they treated customers, but how they treated each other. Ethan noticed one staffer in the kitchen, probably Luis the dishwasher, was being ignored entirely. No hellos, no small talk, not even a nod. It struck him as oddly cold. Despite those early red flags, Ethan reminded himself not to jump to conclusions. On the surface, everything seemed to be running without major issues. Orders were coming out on time, food looked presentable, and customers weren't complaining. In a business like this, smooth service during the lunch rush usually meant a well-oiled machine. Still, Ethan had seen enough to know that what appeared smooth on the outside could easily mask tension beneath. He sipped from the cup of water brought to him and kept observing. This was just the beginning. A manager, probably around 30. Name tag reading Cara, floated between the kitchen and the front counter. She gave the impression of being in control, occasionally glancing at a clipboard, but Ethan didn't see her offer encouragement or feedback to the team. Instead, her body language suggested stress, stiff posture, tight jaw, and rushed movements. She gave brief instructions, but rarely smiled or engaged with customers. It wasn't poor management, but it wasn't inspired leadership either. Ethan noted that leadership fatigue could trickle down to the entire staff. If Cara felt unsupported or burnt out, it might explain the disengagement he was witnessing. Ethan reached for the menu and pretended to study it, still watching from the corner of his eye. He noticed Tracy, one of the employees from earlier, making subtle gestures toward another server while looking at a customer seated alone. There was a stifled laugh. These weren't the kinds of behaviors that would make a Yelp review, but they chipped away at the spirit of the diner. One moment at a time. Ethan felt a growing weight in his chest. Was this the culture that had formed in his absence? He needed more time to be sure. As the minutes passed, Ethan knew the picture wasn't yet complete, but he had seen enough to feel uneasy. Grill Haven looked good on the surface, but there was a disconnect between employees, between staff and customers, and possibly between the team and the values the diner was built on. Ethan wrote a note on a napkin and tucked it into his coat pocket. It was time to dig deeper. Listen more closely and see what happened when people thought no one important was paying attention. Ethan waited until the lunch crowd thinned just slightly before standing up from his booth and approaching the counter. The line had been steady, and he didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to himself by rushing. As he reached the front, he offered a polite nod to the cashier. Megan, the same young woman he'd been watching since he arrived. She didn't smile, didn't make eye contact, just asked, "What can I get for you?" in the same monotone she used with the other guests. It stung a little. Grill Haven was supposed to be known for warmth and charm, not transactional exchanges. Still, Ethan kept his cover and responded simply, "1 hot dog with mustard, please." That's it. Megan punched in the order without hesitation and replied. $3.75. Ethan pulled a few bills from his wallet, deliberately fumbling a bit to keep up the act. She handed him a small receipt without a word and gestured toward the waiting area with a nod. There was no thank you, no effort to make him feel seen or welcome. In that moment, Ethan felt what it was like to be just another nameless customer in a place that was supposed to feel like home. As he stepped aside to wait near the end of the counter, he tucked the receipt into his pocket and leaned casually on the divider, appearing unbothered. From his new vantage point, Ethan could see more than just the service area. He had a partial view of the prep station, where one employee was assembling hot dogs while another restocked condiments. Neither seemed rushed, but neither seemed particularly engaged either. There was no music playing in the background, an odd choice, considering he had always insisted on a light soundtrack to create a cheerful ambience. Without it, the diner felt sterile. Every footstep echoed a little louder. Every customer interaction felt more exposed. Ethan glanced over his shoulder at the rest of the dining room and noticed a family trying to get the attention of a server who walked right past them without acknowledging their raised hands. Back at the counter, Megan chatted in hushed tones with a co-worker named Tracy. Ethan couldn't hear what was being said, but their body language was telling. Leaning in, exchanging glances, muffled laughter. It was the kind of casual conversation that didn't belong during peak hours. Neither of them seemed to notice the older man seated near the window, struggling to carry his tray back to his table. No one offered to help. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. These weren't the values he had instilled when he built this business. It wasn't about the hot dog. It was about what it symbolized: service care, and the little things that made Grill Haven more than just a diner. When his order was finally called out, it was delivered without any personal touch. Megan didn't call his number, just set the tray on the counter and resumed her quiet conversation. Ethan stepped forward, collected his food, and offered a soft, "Thank you," but it was met with silence. He sat back down at his booth with the hot dog and mustard, pretending to eat while still taking mental notes. The food itself was fine: warm bun, good snap on the sausage, but it couldn't cover the larger issue. The soul of the diner, the thing that made it special, was missing. Ethan took small bites and glanced occasionally at the kitchen, the servers and the customers around him. He noticed how little genuine interaction occurred. Employees stuck to their tasks, avoided unnecessary eye contact, and moved with mechanical precision. But there was no laughter, no spark, no warmth. That absence was more alarming than any health code violation or financial shortfall. It was cultural erosion. Ethan didn't need spreadsheets or performance reviews to see it. He felt it in the way his simple hot dog was served with indifference. It was time to dig deeper. He finished his meal, slowly wiping his hands with a paper napkin as he thought about what his next step should be. For now, his cover remained intact. No one suspected a thing. But the truth was becoming clearer with every passing minute. This wasn't the Grill Haven he built, and it wasn't the Grill Haven he was going to leave untouched. The real work had just begun. As Ethan sat quietly in his booth, chewing slowly and pretending to enjoy his hot dog, his ears remained alert. From just a few feet away behind the counter, Megan and Tracy's voices began to rise, no longer hushed. They spoke in a casual, almost careless tone, as though completely unaware or perhaps indifferent to the fact that customers were nearby. Ethan had positioned himself close enough to catch every word, and what he heard next made his stomach churn more than the mustard ever could. The two women began talking about someone named Luis. It was clear from their tone and the words they chose that this wasn't light-hearted banter. It was mean-spirited. "Did you see the way Luis was scrubbing the trays today?" Megan said, barely containing a smirk. "It's like he thinks washing dishes deserves a medal or something." Tracy laughed and added, "Honestly, I don't even know why they keep him around. He doesn't talk to anyone. He's always hunched over in the back like some creepy cave troll." The pair continued tossing insults back and forth as if it were a private game. They rolled their eyes, laughed under their breath, and spoke about Luis as if he were invisible, unworthy of basic decency. It was the kind of toxic behavior that festers in places where leadership stops paying attention, where respect becomes optional. Ethan's heart sank. Luis had been with Grill Haven for nearly 2 years. He remembered hiring him personally at one of the quarterly job fairs the company hosted for local residents. Luis was quiet, yes, but diligent, punctual, and honest. The kind of employee who never sought praise but deserved it tenfold. Hearing him spoken of with such contempt hit Ethan on a deeply personal level. This wasn't just about a dishwasher being mocked. It was about a system that allowed such mockery to go unchecked. The culture Ethan had fought to build, one rooted in humility, kindness, and inclusion, was unraveling right in front of him. He kept his expression neutral, careful not to react in a way that would blow his cover, but inside a storm was brewing. The casual cruelty on display revealed something darker than a bad attitude. It suggested a breakdown in accountability, in leadership, and in the basic human values that should have governed the diner's everyday interactions. If Megan and Tracy felt emboldened enough to speak this way in front of customers, what might they be saying when no one else was around? And worse, how many other employees had been the target of their venom? How long had this been going on? The thought that no one had intervened, that no manager had stepped in to say, "That's not acceptable here," haunted Ethan. He scanned the room to see if anyone else had heard, but most customers were either engrossed in their meals or too polite to look up Kara. The shift manager was nowhere in sight. Ethan had hoped he might find a few cracks to repair during his visit. But this was different. This wasn't a surface-level problem. This was rot at the root. The behavior he'd just witnessed wasn't just unprofessional. It was corrosive. Sitting there in silence, Ethan knew this moment would define the rest of his investigation. The mask of normalcy had fallen. Grill Haven was no longer just a diner in need of polish. It was a workplace in need of healing. The gossip, the disrespect, the normalization of cruelty, these were symptoms of something systemic. And as much as it pained him to admit, Ethan realized that some of that failure rested on his own shoulders. He had trusted too much, delegated too freely, and assumed the culture he built would hold without constant care. Now he would have to find a way to restore it, one difficult truth at a time. Behind the clamor of clinking dishes and sizzling griddles, Luis quietly worked in the far corner of the kitchen, unseen by most and acknowledged by few. He was the kind of employee who clocked in early and never complained, the backbone of any successful diner, the one doing the dirty work others avoided. Luis scrubbed greasy pans, cleaned clogged drains, wiped down the back prep counters, and restocked heavy containers without hesitation. His shirt was often soaked by mid-shift, and his hands bore the signs of daily hard labor: cracked knuckles, faded calluses, and the faint chemical burn from endless sanitizing agents. Yet not once had Ethan ever heard him raise his voice or show signs of frustration. Luis moved through his tasks like a craftsman, with precision and quiet dignity. What troubled Ethan most wasn't just the disrespectful words he had overheard, but the contrast between those words and the truth he knew about Luis. The Luis he remembered from quarterly team meetings and employee appreciation events was a man of few words but strong actions. He rarely spoke up, preferring instead to listen, nod, and return to work. And every time a shift was understaffed or the kitchen was overwhelmed, Luis was the one who stayed late, took extra shifts, and never asked for recognition. That level of consistency of quiet devotion should have earned him admiration. Instead, it had made him invisible. As Ethan watched him from afar, he noticed something else. Luis didn't interact much with the other staff anymore. He kept his head down, avoided eye contact, and rarely ventured beyond the back line. It wasn't hard to read between the lines. The mockery he had heard from Megan and Tracy likely wasn't an isolated incident. It had worn Luis down, isolating him, in the very place he came every day to do his best. Ethan wondered how many times Luis had heard those whispered jabs, how many days he had swallowed the hurt in silence, and worst of all, how many people had witnessed it and said nothing. It struck Ethan deeply more than he expected. Grill Haven had always been about second chances. Many of its employees, Luis included, had come from backgrounds where they weren't given many. Some had struggled with language barriers, others with tough family lives or financial setbacks. That was the spirit Ethan wanted his company to embody, a place where hard work mattered more than charm, and where dignity was given freely, not earned through popularity. Yet somehow the culture had shifted, and now someone like Luis, loyal, focused, and humble, had become an easy target. It was a betrayal of everything Grill Haven was supposed to stand for. Sitting in his booth with his now cold hot dog, Ethan felt something change in him. The problem wasn't just poor behavior, it was a failure of leadership. Somewhere along the line, the system had stopped protecting people like Luis. It had stopped encouraging kindness and had allowed cliques, gossip, and quiet cruelty to flourish. and Ethan knew that no company memo or staff training could fix that overnight. This required more than policy. It demanded a cultural reckoning, one that started with listening, with seeing, and with holding people accountable for how they treated others, especially those who worked in the shadows. For the rest of his meal, Ethan barely touched his food. His mind replayed every moment he had watched Luis work, every time he had heard Megan or Tracy laugh under their breath, and with each passing second, he felt more resolute. Luis deserved better, not just an apology, but a workplace that honored his contribution and shielded him from mistreatment. Ethan didn't come to Grill Haven that day looking for a villain or a hero, but now that he had found both, he knew the next steps had to be precise and meaningful, because at the heart of it all, Luis's quiet perseverance had just reignited Ethan's mission. Ethan sat in silence for a few more minutes after finishing his meal, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup while his mind replayed everything he had seen and heard. The gossip, the indifference, the disregard for a loyal worker like Luis, it all pointed to a deeper rot in the team's culture. He had come in with the intention of observing quietly, but something about this situation wouldn't allow him to remain passive any longer. He could feel it in his chest, a quiet, growing sense of duty that came not just from being the owner of Grill Haven, but from being a leader who had once promised to create a business rooted in respect. Ethan stood up, took a deep breath, and walked back to the counter with calm, deliberate steps. Megan and Tracy were still behind the register, idly chatting, as if nothing had happened, unaware that their words from earlier had planted the seeds of reckoning. Ethan reached the counter and set his tray down, clearing his throat just enough to draw their attention. Megan glanced at him with the same disinterested expression she had shown all afternoon. "Need something else?" she asked almost lazily. Ethan looked at her for a long second, then at Tracy before responding. Not with anger, but with steady, measured authority. "Actually," he said, "I think it's time I introduce myself properly. I'm Ethan Walker, the owner of Grill Haven." The silence that followed was immediate and complete. The transformation was instantaneous. Megan's face lost all color, and Tracy's eyes widened in disbelief. Their posture changed, their shoulders tightening as if bracing for impact. Ethan didn't raise his voice or slam his hand on the counter. He didn't need to. The weight of his identity, of who he truly was and what he represented, hung in the air heavier than any reprimand. Megan blinked rapidly, struggling to process the moment. Tracy opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. All the smugness, the superiority they had so comfortably worn just minutes before, dissolved under the sudden spotlight of accountability. Ethan let the silence sit for a moment longer, allowing its gravity to do the work. Then he spoke again, this time more softly. "I didn't come here to catch anyone off guard. I came here because I care deeply about this place and the people who work in it, including the ones who are too often overlooked." His eyes briefly flicked toward the back of the kitchen where Luis was still working, unaware of what was happening out front. "What I heard today. The way you spoke about Luis, who's one of the hardest working people on this team, was disappointing. And more than that, it was unacceptable." Neither Megan nor Tracy offered a defense. There was no excuse that could justify what Ethan had overheard. He continued speaking not just to them, but to the values that Grill Haven had lost. Respect is not optional here. Kindness isn't a suggestion. It's who we are or who we're supposed to be. And if that's been forgotten, then it's on me to remind everyone starting right now. His words weren't fiery, but they cut deeply because they came from a place of personal conviction. This wasn't corporate protocol being enforced. It was a founder reclaiming his vision. In that moment, the entire energy of the diner shifted. A few nearby customers had picked up on the conversation and turned their heads. The other staff, sensing something serious was unfolding, paused in their work. Ethan didn't make a scene, but the ripples of his quiet confrontation were undeniable. Megan and Tracy looked smaller now, not just physically, but morally. The truth of who they had been in the shadows was now fully exposed under the light of who stood before them, And while Ethan didn't shame them with dramatic gestures, the honesty in his words did something even more powerful. It forced them to face themselves. By the time Ethan stepped away from the counter, the diner was no longer just a building with booths and fryers. It was a mirror, one that had reflected a truth no one wanted to see, but one that desperately needed to be acknowledged. He hadn't come in with a script or an agenda, but in choosing to speak up to calmly reveal who he was and what he stood for, Ethan had done something far more impactful than punishment. He had started a reckoning, and from that reckoning, real change could finally begin. The room was still quiet as Ethan turned his attention from the stunned cashiers to the rest of the staff. He stepped away from the counter and walked slowly toward the kitchen, his footsteps deliberate, each one echoing with purpose. As he passed through the swinging doors, conversations hushed and heads turned. Luis, still bent over a sink filled with soapy water, barely glanced up at first. He was used to being invisible. Ethan paused for a moment, watching the man work. Shoulders hunched, arms, soaked eyes, focused on every spot he scrubbed. This wasn't just labor, it was dedication, and it was time the rest of the team saw it for what it was, the heartbeat of the diner they all depended on. Clearing his throat, Ethan spoke clearly enough for the kitchen and even parts of the dining room to hear. "Everyone, I need your attention for a moment," he began. "There's something important I need to say." Staff stopped mid-task. The buzz of movement quieted. "This man right here," Ethan continued gesturing to Luis, "has shown more consistency, integrity, and hard work than most people ever notice. Day in and day out. Luis has done one of the toughest jobs in this diner, and he's done it without complaint, without shortcuts, and without expecting recognition." Luis turned slowly, confusion flickering across his face. He glanced at his co-workers, unsure of what was happening. Ethan walked closer to him and smiled softly. "Luis, I want to personally thank you. What you do matters. It matters to me. It matters to the customers who never see what happens back here, but benefit from your work every day, and it should matter to everyone who wears a Grill Haven apron." The room was silent. Nobody moved. For a moment, even Megan and Tracy stood frozen, listening from the pass-through window. Ethan's words weren't grandiose, but they struck like a bell in a quiet chapel. Clear, honest, true. "We don't build great teams by praising only what's visible," Ethan added. "We build them by honoring every role, especially the ones behind the scenes." Louis, still stunned, fumbled with a rag in his hand. "I was just doing my job," he said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "You were doing more than your job. You were showing what pride in work really looks like, and that deserves to be acknowledged." Slowly, a few employees began to nod. One of the line cooks looked down ashamed. Another quietly wiped her hands on her apron and offered a small apologetic smile toward Luis. The ripple effect had begun, not from a punishment or a policy, but from a moment of genuine human recognition. Ethan wasn't just restoring order, he was restoring dignity. As the moment settled in, Ethan turned back toward the full kitchen. Moving forward, he said, "Respect will not be optional here. I don't care if you've been here 5 years or 5 days. I don't care if you're at the front counter or washing dishes in the back. Every person in this building contributes to our success, and every person deserves to be treated with decency." His voice didn't waver. He didn't need to shout. The conviction in his tone was enough to silence any lingering doubt. This wasn't a speech. It was a promise, and it was a reminder of the values Ethan had built. Grill Haven upon values that had clearly been forgotten but were now being revived. Luis stood there, his eyes glistening, still unsure how to respond to the attention. For someone who had spent most of his days in the background, this moment felt like stepping into the sun for the first time. He gave a small nod, unable to find the right words, but Ethan saw the gratitude in his expression. The room slowly returned to motion, but the energy had changed. There was no more giggling, no more side comments. People moved with a sense of reflection, with a recognition that something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, Luis was not just seen, he was celebrated, and in that celebration, a new chapter at Grill Haven had begun. The very next morning, Ethan arrived at Grill Haven's headquarters with a new sense of urgency. He gathered the regional managers, HR representatives, and training supervisors into a small conference room where sunlight spilled across a whiteboard that hadn't been used in months. The message was clear: the time for passive leadership was over. What had begun as a quiet undercover visit had unearthed something deeper than just two rude employees. It had exposed cultural erosion that, left unchecked, would continue to eat away at the heart of his company. Ethan stood at the front of the room, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp. "We're going to rebuild this from the inside out," he said, "and we're starting with something fundamental: respect." By the end of the day, Ethan launched a company-wide initiative titled Respect Starts Here. It was more than just a memo. It was a structured training program that became mandatory for every Grill Haven employee, from new hires to store managers. The training focused on empathy in the workplace, active listening, and the consequences of unchecked gossip or harassment. It featured role-play scenarios, real employee testimonials, and even included footage of Ethan himself addressing the importance of restoring the company's original values. For the first time, the conversation around respect was no longer abstract. It was tangible, immediate, and non-negotiable. Alongside the training, Ethan introduced a revised employee handbook that outlined clearer expectations around teamwork, communication, and accountability. Gone were the vague corporate catchphrases. In their place were practical, everyday examples of what respectful behavior looked like and what it didn't. Employees were no longer allowed to hide behind, "That's just how I talk," or "we were just joking." The new guidelines spelled it out plainly. All roles matter, all voices deserve respect, and anyone found belittling or isolating their co-workers would be held accountable. Managers were tasked with modeling the behavior they expected and received additional leadership development to help them navigate conflicts with fairness and clarity. But Ethan knew that culture wasn't something you could fix in a day, or even with a few training sessions. It had to be nurtured. That's why he implemented a new system of scheduled check-ins at every location. Once a month, team leads would hold anonymous feedback sessions where employees could safely voice concerns or highlight positive experiences. These weren't optional meetings, they were built into the workweek and backed by HR support. Regional managers were given tools to track engagement trends and intervene early if red flags appeared. It wasn't about micromanaging. It was about listening, about creating safe spaces where employees knew their voices mattered. The changes rippled quickly. At first, there was resistance. Some employees rolled their eyes at the thought of another training. A few long-time staffers muttered under their breath about things being too sensitive these days. But as the weeks went on, something shifted. Employees who had once stayed silent began speaking up. Teams that had felt divided by cliques started opening up during check-ins. One store even reported a 25% increase in employee satisfaction scores after just 2 months. More importantly, stories like Luis's were no longer the exception, they were becoming the inspiration. Respect wasn't just a buzzword anymore. It was a living, breathing part of daily operations, back at the original location where it all began. Ethan returned for a surprise visit this time, not in disguise. He walked through the front door, greeted by staff who stood a little taller and smiled a little warmer. The energy was different. Megan and Tracy were no longer employed there, but the shift they left behind had paved the way for something better. The new team worked together like a family, not perfect, but committed. Ethan paused by the kitchen where Luis now wore a clean white apron and a quiet confidence. He wasn't just the dishwasher anymore. He had been promoted to kitchen coordinator. Ethan smiled to himself. The reforms weren't just working. They were restoring something sacred. And in that quiet return to dignity, Grill Haven was finding its way back home. In the weeks that followed Ethan's sweeping reforms, a subtle but noticeable tension settled over several Grill Haven locations. At first, many employees, especially the longer-tenured ones, felt a strange unease. It wasn't that they disagreed with the values Ethan was championing. Most people in theory believed in kindness, respect, and fairness, but theory and practice were two very different things. The sudden shift in expectations left some staff feeling exposed. A few grumbled that they were being watched too closely now. Others questioned if the new emphasis on emotional intelligence was just a phase that would fade away like previous initiatives. For those used to flying under the radar or leaning into sarcasm as a form of workplace bonding, the changes felt like a clampdown on personality. Even managers weren't immune to the discomfort. Some worried they'd lose credibility by suddenly holding their teams accountable for behaviors they had previously ignored. A few shift leaders quietly resented the monthly check-ins, viewing them as yet another task in an already overwhelming schedule. But Ethan anticipated this friction. Change always came with resistance, especially when it asked people to look inward. That's why he didn't just implement policies, he provided support. HR teams began showing up more often in the field, offering one-on-one coaching and group sessions to help teams adjust. The company's internal messaging shifted too. Instead of talking about compliance, they spoke about culture care, and slowly that new language began to take root. The turning point came not with a grand announcement, but through a series of small human moments. At the Midtown location, a prep cook named Janelle stood up during a check-in and shared how grateful she was that someone finally noticed her birthday, something that had never happened in 3 years of employment. At another branch, a young server named Malik admitted he used to dread coming in for shifts, but now felt safer speaking up when things went wrong. These weren't massive declarations, but they carried weight. When employees saw that vulnerability was being met with support instead of judgment, the air began to change. Laughter returned to break rooms, and teamwork started to look less like obligation and more like intention. Megan and Tracy's absence also had an unspoken impact. Though few talked about them openly, their departure sent a quiet signal that accountability wasn't just a buzzword. People began to understand that Ethan wasn't simply reacting to a one-time incident, he was rebuilding a standard, and that standard, once it was clarified, gave others the courage to rise to it. Formerly reserved employees began mentoring newer hires. One store created its own recognition board where team members could anonymously post shout-outs to their co-workers. It wasn't mandatory, and yet it flourished because people were finally being seen and they wanted to pay that feeling forward. As the dust settled, a new sense of rhythm emerged within the teams. Morale was on the rise, not because the work had gotten easier, but because the environment had grown healthier. Tasks were still fast-paced and physically demanding, but there was more cooperation. When someone was struggling on the line, others jumped in without being asked. Managers began using check-ins, not just to correct issues, but to celebrate wins. Even skeptical employees, who once kept to themselves, found new value in being part of something more connected. It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. One shift, one interaction, one act of kindness at a time. Ethan visited a different location every few days, quietly observing the shifts in tone and energy. He watched as employees greeted each other with more sincerity, as team huddles ended with laughter instead of silence. It was in these ordinary moments that he saw the extraordinary change taking shape. The reform wasn't just improving performance metrics, it was creating a better place to work and, in turn, a better place to dine. Grill Haven was no longer just reacting to a problem, it was building a future, one where culture was treated not as a slogan, but as the foundation of everything. Ethan smiled, knowing the hardest part was behind them, and the best part was just beginning. By the start of the 3rd month after the reforms, the changes at Grill Haven had begun to radiate outward, beyond the kitchen doors, beyond the break rooms, and right into the heart of the customer experience. Guests who had frequented the diner for years began to notice subtle but unmistakable differences. The smiles were brighter. The greetings were warmer. Orders were taken with a new energy, and mistakes, when they happened, were handled with sincerity and accountability rather than defensiveness. It was as though the air itself had changed. There was no longer that invisible wall of tension that had lingered behind the counter. In its place was something Ethan had dreamed of restoring: genuine hospitality. One of the first signs of this shift came from a customer named Mr. Dalton, a retired schoolteacher who had eaten at the same booth every Thursday afternoon for nearly a decade. On his most recent visit, he lingered at the register after paying, then leaned toward the cashier and said with a chuckle, "I don't know what's in the coffee these days, but everyone's smiling like they actually want to be here." The cashier, a new hire named Tasha, beamed. She hadn't been part of the old culture and didn't realize the weight of that comment, but Ethan, standing a few feet away on an unannounced visit, heard every word, and it meant everything. It wasn't just the staff who were changing, the regulars were feeling it too. Soon similar comments began trickling in through comment cards, Yelp reviews, and social media posts. Phrases like "welcoming felt like family" and "such a nice atmosphere" became more frequent. One family even left a handwritten note on their table thanking the staff for bringing joy back to dining out. It wasn't a marketing campaign. It wasn't a gimmick. It was the organic result of a culture where people cared, where employees felt safe enough to be kind, and customers could feel that care without even realizing why words spread not through ads or flashy promos, but through quiet consistency. Grill Haven was becoming more than a diner again. It was becoming a trusted part of the community. Even the newer locations, those that hadn't yet developed a loyal base, began seeing increased foot traffic. Customers who had visited once out of convenience found themselves coming back drawn in, not just by the food, but by the feeling. Ethan received an email from a young couple who had stopped in on their road trip. "We've eaten at plenty of diners," it read, "but something about this place felt different. We could tell your team actually enjoyed being there. It made the food taste even better." That message, printed and framed, was hung near the staff board in every location. It served as a quiet reminder culture wasn't just an internal benefit. It was a gift passed on to every guest who walked through the door. The change didn't just lift the spirits of returning customers, it inspired the employees too. They began to take pride in the praise, to see their efforts reflected in the gratitude of the people they served. Staff who had once viewed their job as just a paycheck started to feel part of something meaningful. A few even pitched new ideas, rotating customer appreciation days, a kids eat free night, and birthday shout-outs during team meetings. Ethan encouraged it all. He knew now that culture couldn't be forced from the top. It had to be cultivated through shared ownership. And when customers became part of that culture, the bond between community and business grew even stronger. As Ethan sat in one of the booths on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, sipping a black coffee and listening to the gentle hum of happy conversations, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace Grill Haven had found its rhythm again, not in perfection, but in presence. People cared, and that care was visible in every detail, from the way napkins were folded to the way a cashier said goodbye. Customers didn't always know the full story, but they could feel it. They could feel the warmth, the effort, the unity. And that was the greatest confirmation Ethan could ask for, that the change wasn't just real, it was resonating. Grill Haven's reputation had come full circle, not because of marketing, but because of meaning. As the months rolled on, the transformation within Grill Haven didn't just sustain, it flourished. The energy that had begun as a ripple now pulsed steadily through every location, and for the first time in years, the staff turnover rate dropped significantly. Team members who once viewed their positions as temporary started thinking long-term. Hostesses applied for shift leader roles. Line cooks asked about career paths within the company. Even the night janitor began attending team huddles voluntarily. It wasn't about pay raises or flashy perks. It was about the simple, powerful truth that people stayed where they felt respected, heard, and valued. Grill Haven had finally become that place again. One of the most poignant signs of this cultural rebirth was Luis. The once overlooked dishwasher, who had worked in the shadows, now stood proudly at the forefront of the kitchen. Following Ethan's public recognition and months of consistent excellence, Luis was officially promoted to lead kitchen coordinator. The announcement was made at the quarterly team meeting, not through a corporate email, but in person. Ethan himself handed Luis a new black apron embroidered with his title. The room erupted in applause, and for a brief moment, Luis, always modest, let himself smile fully. His story spread across the company as a quiet legend. The man who kept his head down treated everyone with dignity and proved that true leadership isn't always loud, it's consistent. Luis's promotion did more than elevate him. It inspired a wave of introspection and ambition. Employees began to look at their own roles differently. They saw that character mattered just as much as skill, that hard work wasn't invisible anymore. Ethan noticed this shift in the little things, like how team members now stepped up without being asked, or how feedback was given more constructively between peers. A shared sense of ownership took hold. Staff meetings turned from dry briefings into collaborative sessions, filled with laughter, questions, and mutual respect. Grill Haven no longer felt like a place people passed through. It felt like a place they could grow within. Externally, the impact was just as significant. As internal trust strengthened, external loyalty soared. Regular customers brought friends, and newcomers quickly became regulars. Local newspapers began writing features on the Grill Haven comeback, highlighting its return to community roots, and the personal leadership of its founder's social media buzzed with positive reviews, not just about the food, but about the people. "You can feel the heart here," one post read, showing a picture of Luis behind the line, smiling next to a new trainee. The diner chain began seeing record-setting months, not because of flashy discounts or new menu gimmicks, but because of something far more sustainable, authentic connection. Financial reports mirrored the emotional momentum. Profits rose steadily across multiple locations, driven by higher employee retention, lower training costs, and increased customer return rates. Ethan didn't need to look at spreadsheets to know why it was all about trust. When employees believed in the mission and felt supported, they worked better. When customers sensed that harmony, they returned. That formula wasn't new, but it had been forgotten amidst the daily grind. Now it was the foundation again. And Ethan made sure to reinvest that success directly into the people offering new scholarship opportunities, expanding the health benefits package, and even setting aside funding for employee-led community service projects. Looking back, Ethan often thought about the day he sat in that booth undercover, chewing a lukewarm hot dog and listening to voices that didn't know they were being heard. It was a painful day, but it had been the spark. What followed wasn't easy. It had taken confrontation, accountability, and a willingness to feel uncomfortable. But now, walking through the doors of any Grill Haven location, Ethan didn't feel shame or disappointment. He felt pride. Not in a brand, but in the people who made it meaningful. The growth they'd achieved wasn't just financial, it was moral, cultural, and deeply human. And as Luis wiped down a counter late one night, smiling quietly at a trainee who reminded him of himself, Ethan knew the future of Grill Haven wasn't just safe, it was thriving. On a quiet Sunday morning, well before the first customer walked through the door, Ethan Walker stood alone in the original Grill Haven location, the same one where everything had begun, and where just months earlier he had witnessed the cracks beneath the surface of his own company. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, casting soft golden lines across the red vinyl booths and polished counter. The diner was silent except for the soft hum of refrigerators and the faint ticking of the old wall clock. Ethan walked slowly through the dining room, running his hand along the edge of a table, taking in the stillness. It was in this exact space, dressed in a hoodie and worn-out jeans, that he had rediscovered something he'd nearly forgotten: the power of presence. Looking back now, the undercover visit stood out as one of the most profound leadership moments of his life. Not because it was dramatic or cinematic, but because it stripped everything down to what really mattered. No titles, no presentations, no boardrooms or status, just raw, unfiltered reality. He hadn't gone undercover to catch people doing something wrong. He had gone to understand what it felt like to be on the other side of the counter. And what he discovered, not just in the cruel whispers of a few employees, but in the quiet persistence of people like Luis, was a culture that had lost its compass. It wasn't anyone's fault entirely, but it had become everyone's responsibility to fix. That journey taught Ethan that leadership isn't about grand strategies or quarterly targets. It's about showing up. It's about watching how people treat each other when they think no one's looking. It's about asking questions with genuine curiosity and being willing to listen, not to reply, but to understand. Somewhere along the way, he had become distant, not physically, but emotionally. Trusting his team was a strength, but detaching from the day-to-day human experiences had cost him something. It had cost Grill Haven something. The undercover experience didn't just give him insight into his company, it gave him insight into himself. Now, whenever Ethan trained a new manager or spoke at a leadership event, he didn't start with metrics or market trends. He started with the story, not the one about profits rising or reputation restored, but the story of the day. He sat in his own booth, eating a hot dog and hearing the truth. He spoke of Luis, of the courage it took to change, and of the humility required to admit that culture doesn't run on autopilot. That leadership isn't about being at the top, it's about staying connected at every level. And most of all, he spoke of dignity. The quiet kind. The kind that lives in everyday decisions, in the way someone is greeted at the door or spoken to in a staff meeting. Ethan had always believed in dignity as a value, but the undercover experience cemented that belief into a guiding principle. He saw firsthand that when dignity is protected, when people feel safe, respected, and seen, everything else follows. Productivity rises, loyalty deepens, innovation flourishes. But when dignity is dismissed, when people are reduced to roles instead of humans, even the best business strategies fall flat. Grill Haven's turnaround wasn't fueled by a rebranding campaign or new menu items. It was fueled by restoring the basic promise that everyone from dishwasher to diner guest mattered. As the sun climbed higher and staff began to arrive for their morning prep, Ethan stepped outside and looked up at the faded sign above the entrance. It read simply, Grill Haven. Since 1998. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a story. A living story about mistakes, growth, redemption, and the enduring strength of human connection. And as Ethan walked back to his car, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man who had come full circle, who had once walked in unnoticed and walked out awakened. The journey had changed him, and in doing so, it had changed everything. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of empathy in leadership, don't forget to support our journey by liking this video, subscribing to Deep Inside HQ, and turning on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Share this with someone who believes in dignity at work and the quiet strength of doing what's right. Your engagement helps us continue uncovering the human truths hidden in everyday places. Thank you for being a part of the Deep Inside HQ community, where every story reveals something deeper.